as well as the topic he's going to talk about today, which is his recently published book, Penality in the Underground. So you come to hear him, not me, so I'm going to shut up, and he can tell you all about the contents of the book.
Thanks, Ian. I think there's more chairs over there. You sure? We did this marketing thing of creating a deficit of chairs, so it will be very busy. I'll try to stand so people can see the screen. Is there a camera or just audio on?
This camera is also on.
Okay.
For the people online.
So they'll see you rather than me.
Exactly. Well, unfortunately, they'll see the people in the audience.
Okay, it's a better deal for them. So our topic is how rebel groups pursue informers, and how the perspective of the sociology of punishment, or punishment in society, as we sometimes call it. I feel like Caroline is talking about surveillance.
She's harmless, she'll be fine.
So I'm going to talk about how rebel groups pursue informers, and how I would like to suggest the sociology of punishment, or what we sometimes call punishment in society, can help us understand deeper and better this practice. And as we will see, this is a very common and important phenomenon. So I will elaborate on this, of course, but non-state armed groups are an increasingly important actor in world affairs and global politics. Virtually all of them are preoccupied with informers that may operate in the ranks or in the communities in which they operate. And this has major effects in diverse ways on societies, on communities, on the dynamics of conflict and of post-conflict. But somehow this issue, which I'll try to convince you is interesting and important, it has thus far, as they say, you know, every lecture starts with saying, I'm the first one who thought about it. So I'm not the first one who discovered the phenomena, but somehow it slipped the attention of criminologists and sociologists of punishment. And of course, it is mentioned a lot in the media, and it is mentioned in general studies of armed groups. But it rarely gets a kind of systematic analytical attention. The assumption is armed groups are scared of informers, so they kill them. It's a kind of mechanical, automatic response. That's it. And I was interested to go beneath the surface, as they say, and to ask how is the pursuit of informers actually being carried out in practice? What forms does it take? What constrains it? What mobilizes it? I was especially interested to explore what functions the pursuit of informers has, explicit function and hidden functions, and to ask whether informers can actually also benefit a rebel movement. Can it be a security problem, but also at the same time a solution to other problems? And what I was trying to do, and I will try to briefly show today, I'll speak for like 5 hours, but what I will try to show today is that if we treat this practice not as terrorism, but as punishment, it unlocks all sorts of avenues for interpretation and new questions and new insights about all of it. So that's kind of the preview, but I should, before I start, obviously thank Ian and Caroline for inviting me to give this talk and for facilitating my month as an academic visitor here, which is, again, there's this kind of cliche formula, a pleasure and a privilege, but it is really a pleasure and a privilege to be associated with the center, even if briefly. And many of the people here and elsewhere in the center have been inspiring my work and have featured in my bibliographies, both in this book and in my work on the death penalty and on other issues. So it's really great to be here. So of course, an honor, and it's also a bit intimidating to speak at the grand setting and prestigious platform of All Souls College, and to be the first night of the season for this year. So thank you for that, and I trust the subsequent speakers will remember me fondly for setting the bar so low. So it's that. And as Ian said, this is the first talk I'm giving after the book was out just a few weeks ago in the University Press of this same institution, and in the Clarendon Studies in Criminology, edited by Caroline and by Mary. So that's also great, and I'm trying to in very subtle ways promote it, encourage you to buy it, kind of subliminal, you won't notice. I discovered, by the way, that if you Google Penalty in the Underground, which is the title, it autocorrects to Penalty in the Underground, and then the results is about paying fines on the tube. Seriously. So I think we should all kind of type penalty a lot in emails and so on, and then the algorithm would recognize it. Okay, so the plan for today, I will start with this concept of underground penalty, which I kind of proofread it an hour ago, and I actually used penalty just so I'm going to explain what I mean by underground penalty, and I will do it through connecting two issues. One of them is the empirical case of armed groups, and the other is the theoretical advancement in punishment in society and the expansion of the remit to beyond the traditional interest in the criminal justice system. I will then talk briefly, just set the background about, I'll try to do a kind of half-minute introduction to Ireland and the Irish conflict, and just the kind of cultural, historical background on informing in the Irish context. And then I will focus on three issues, three features and functions, which are kind of the heart of the book, and one of them is the issue of legitimacy, how the pursuit of informants by armed groups is both constrained and mobilized by legitimacy. The other one is how the ambition of rebels to actually behave like states also affect the pursuit of informants. And the other one is social control and what I call governing through informing, which, like many others I've taken from Jonathan Simon's work, Governing Through Crime, and to show how actually informants, as I said, are a problem but also a solution for rebel groups. If we'll have time, I'll also talk about some post-conflict development since the peace process and until today. Knowing myself, I'm not sure if we'll have time, but we can talk about it in the discussion. If anyone, if you would like to ask, what about post-conflict development? I'll answer. And just to say, of course, it's not going to be a summary of the book. It's not going to be a summary of the topic. So there's a lot of issues and points I'm not going to mention in the talk itself, and we can talk about it in the discussion. I'm not going to do a methodology thingy, but just to mention, the research was based to a large degree on interviews I've carried out with former members of the IRA and with other people who were kind of were in a position to be informed observers on the organization, and some archival digging. So I'm going to use a lot of quotes from interviews and from statements to illustrate the point, and without the full references. You're just going to see quotes. And just to say also, I mean, the format is I'm going to talk a lot and then there's going to be Q&A, but if something is absolutely not clear and you have a kind of quick clarification question, feel free to ask. If I'm not making sense or if something is really not clear, just, you know, I'll be happy to stop for a moment and kind of try to raise your eyebrows expressively so I know something is not clear. Okay. So in recent years, there's been a lot of interest in definitions of punishment. And I think this is generally expanding the remit of what we study in punishment of society. So there's definitional debate, but generally they're expanding rather than restricting the subject matter. And I think academic fields, I think, tend to go in cycles on these issues. I mean, there's something similar going in the sociology of human rights where, and I think with the punishment in society where the field was, yeah, we can discuss it, but the field that was established or re-established in the early 90s with David Garland's work and so on. So we had definitional issues then, and I think it's returning now when the field is kind of more mature and settled. So some of the drivers for that are theoretical concerns, some of the empirical case studies. So we have the notion that criminal justice punishment is actually much broader than imprisonment and fines and so on. We have the shadow carceral state. We have interesting practices which ostensibly are not punishment, are not claimed as punishment, but we think they actually are also punishment, like migration control and marriage work and so on. From a different direction, we have the interest in non-state actors doing social control, private security companies, which, as you know, Ian has been working on for a long time, and all sorts of civil society-based punishment. So if you go through the table of contents of punishment in society, as I've done obsessively, just the titles, I didn't read all of it. So you can see articles on, for example, punitive logics and governance in sports. Okay, it's expanding and expanding disciplinary tribunals in universities. Okay, there's work on social control of plagiarism among academics. It's expanding and expanding. And from yet another direction, we have studies of criminals and criminal organizations as themselves agents of punishment and social control. So Donald Black's club.
It's a touch screen.
Gotcha. So Donald Black's classic crime as social control, David Scarberg's work on prison gangs as agents of social control, and so on. So this is the kind of theoretical from the discipline context. But as I said, we've been missing an important, big, lively issue, which is armed groups. So armed groups are basically non-state organizations which use violence to achieve political goals. We can spend the whole day arguing about the exact definitions, but let's not. The important thing, it's non-state, it's organized, an organized group. They use violence along other means, and they're political rather than for-profit criminal. It's often overlaps, we can talk about it, but that's the general idea. Armed groups is now considered the more neutral, technical, common terms, both in international law and in the social science studies. We sometimes call them rebels, we sometimes call them underground groups, terrorists, insurgents, freedom fighters, and so on. I'm kind of alternating between armed groups and rebel and underground. Let's treat them as interchangeable for now, just sometimes the alliteration is better. I'm not using the term terrorist, and I'm not using the term freedom fighters because that's normatively loaded. So right now we have armed groups all over the place, okay, in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, and in Thailand and India and Burma, in the Ukraine, in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is now. Earlier, you know, the anti-colonial struggles in Africa and elsewhere, in the civil wars and insurgencies of Central America and South America, in the former Yugoslavia, in Italy and West Germany in the 70s, and in Northern Ireland. So last year, the International Committee of the Red Cross last year estimated that around the world between 60 and 80 million people live under the direct and exclusive control of state-like governance of armed groups, which is a huge number, but I think it's a very conservative estimate. I mean, the ICRC are conservative, and it's about direct, exclusive control, and a lot of the time people live under the influence of both state authorities and non-state authorities, and it's a static picture. It's 2021. If you look at the past 50 years, and if you include people who were under some measure of influence of non-state armed groups, it's a huge chunk of the world's population. Now, when we think about armed groups, we think about violence they use against the adversaries, against the government, against the other side's population. But armed groups are also governance actors. Many, not all, and the variety and diversity is one of the interesting points here, and we'll get to it. But many armed groups engage not only in violence, but also in governance of their own population. They mimic state functions, they provide health, they provide education, they collect taxes. ISIS, the Islamic State, which called itself the Islamic State, and the BBC called it the so-called Islamic State because it's so important. They had, apart from everything else, they had a system of collecting rubbish, which apparently was more efficient than in Manhattan. I mean, they do all sorts of things, and they also use penal code and penal system and courts. So again, not all armed groups, but many armed groups had penal systems or have penal systems. Different ideologies, different locations. It's the Taliban and ISIS. It's Maoist groups in Nepal, FARC in Colombia, SPLA in Sudan, and on and on and on. Sometimes these courts will have jurisdiction over the group's former members, sometimes about the whole population. Sometimes they enforce religious norms, sometimes they settle disputes, sometimes they act as criminal, they do criminal punishment. Sanctions, which are ranging from killing, corporal punishment, imprisonment and detention in some cases, fines, expulsions, and so on. Sometimes it's very rudimentary, sometimes it's very developed. The LTTE in Sri Lanka, sometimes known as the Tamil Tigers, they had a three-tier court system with regional courts, court of appeals, constitutional court, and so on. So in the past 5 years, really, there's been a lot of interest in political science and some books about rebel rulers and rebel governance. For them, it helps in the discussion of what is sovereignty and what is governance. There's been a lot of interest, and again, it's really in the past few years in international law, among international lawyers, but as I said, punishment in society has generally missed it, until, which I think is surprising, because if we're talking about sport and plagiarism and so on, you would have thought people will storm and use it. I think it partly relates to the critique from Southern Criminology about criminology not dealing with political violence and so on. It's maybe also a question of sources, it's hard to do interviews and archives and so on. But in any case, if you look at the Sage Handbook of Punishment in Society and so on, there's nothing really on that. Now, within this penal system, the most common case sanctions of rebel doing this kind of punitive governance is in the context of informing. So I'll backtrack for a second. Informers are people who pass information to the authorities secretly about illegal activities. And again, we can elaborate and discuss and refine the definitions, but let's stick with that. And it's one of the most common, most effective tools of policing, of law enforcement, and of counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism. And the aversion, the hatred of informers is one of the most common, prominent themes among outlaws or alienated populations. So in the inmate social code that Sykes and Messenger articulated, one of the classic texts of prison sociology, the first one is never read on a con. The Code of the Streets, Anderson's work from 20 years ago about the US, the whole so-called Stop Snitching campaign in the US at the moment. Historically, Foucault in Discipline and Punish, he writes about the pursuit of informers as one of the expressions of anti-state solidarity that the state had to break. If in E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, the 800 dense pages are really littered with references to informers. Some of them famous, notorious, Oliver the Spy from Peterloo, if you came across it. And he has a side remark where he said you can actually write a really interesting history of this whole radical illegal movement if you just look through the prism of how informers affected the movement, which he didn't write. I mean, he done enough, but that was kind of one of my pointers. The idea is that, yeah, if you, Eric Hauptbaum on bandits is full with this kind of Robin Hood myth who can only be captured if he's betrayed from within. Marcus Rediker on piracy, a more recent book, which I would recommend. I mean, the book, not piracy. Don't go ahead if you want. Where you have outlaws, where you have communities and groups of people who defy the state's authority and they become outlaws. The concern about the dishonest, distrustful fellow outlaw becomes paramount. Okay, that's one of the key issues. We see that, and even more so when we move to identity-based or ethno-national political conflicts. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Northern Ireland conflict, and so on. In these situations, when you are an informer for the regime, you not only betray your comrades, friends, colleagues, you betray your nation, your imagined community, you betray your religion, you betray your ethnic ethos, and this becomes much worse. And it's also part of the universal condemnation of wartime betrayal in non-states group and with states. So as many of you would know, many states have retained the death penalty for treason while abolishing it for murder. That was the case in the UK for a 30-year period or something like that, even more. So this combination of identity-based betrayal and wartime betrayal create a very explosive mix. And in the writings of guerrilla leaders, rebel leaders, terrorist leaders, you see it all the time. One of the Bibles of insurgents from the 1950s till today is the revolt by Menachem Begin, who later was also Prime Minister of Israel. But in the 40s, he was the leader of the Irgun, one of the underground Zionist groups fighting against the British. And this book is really, it influenced the first leader of the modern IRA. It's all over the place. And Begin writes there, the informer is the most terrible of enemies. A fighting underground has its own laws, one of which is that the informer must pay with his life. Okay, so, and again, you can see even the terminology here already, laws and so on. And again, we see it in Gaza, we've seen it now in the Ukraine, in some of the occupied disputed territories. It's there all over the place. So pulling these strings together, I want to suggest that the pursuit of informers should be considered as punishment. Now, again, I'm not the first to, of course, I'm not the first who noted that armed groups are interested in informers. But normally, when you read about it, it comes from the perspective of terrorism studies, and basically it's mentioned, but not considered as something interesting, considered as just another form. It's subsumed under the general condemnation of violence. There's no distinction. And there's no attention to diversity, to constraints, to long-term effects, and so on. When you have description of killing of informers, it's done in a kind of superficial way without, and part of it is coming from this tendency to treat armed groups as inherently evil, irrational, pathological, a problem to be solved rather than a thing to be explained. And the distinction between states and non-state actors. So states are inherently legitimate, non-state actors are inherently illegitimate, and there's a reluctance to use the same theoretical tools in analyzing states and in analyzing non-states. Whereas I suggest that actually the killing of informers is different from other types of violence. It's not normatively better or worse, it's just different. Terrorism is based on indiscriminate attacks. The posh term is collective liability or categorical liability. People are targeted not because of individual wrongdoing, but because they belong to a certain group of people. Victims are interchangeable. Punishment is about individual wrongdoing, and the pursuit of informers is based on the logic of punishment, not on the logic of terrorism. It's a different creature, not better, not worse. It's just different analytically. And in many of these groups, like in the IRA's case, it also involved the vertical relationship of punishments. It's not horizontal feuds and vendettas, but it's an organization that punishes an individual. Armed groups like the IRA claim it as punishment. Okay, so from one perspective, it's not interesting what they're saying and how they call it. Okay, from the state's perspective, it's illegal, it's abduction and murder. Who cares how they call it? From a sociology of punishment perspective, it's interesting that they call it punishment. Okay, let's look at it from within these parameters. And finally, the other aspect about underground penalty, which makes it different from vigilante groups or from private security companies and so on, is that they are anti-state and not just non-state. So a lot of the time, whether vigilantes or private policing and so on, they feel a vacuum that they think the state has created a vacuum, and they try to fill it and kind of do the state's work. Okay, the term is sometimes taking the law into their own hands. But with rebel groups, they try to usurp the state. They are anti-state and not just non-state. So if we look at the founding principle of the sociology of punishment, articulated here by Garland, but it will be a well-known formula for many of us. Punishment is not just a response to crime, but it's also more than that. It is a response to crime, but the causes that determine its forms, the functions, and the consequences are more than just a response to crime. So if we take this principle and we apply it to the case studies, replacing states with armed groups and crime with informing, the rebel pursuit of informing is not just a mechanical response to the risk, it's more than that. Okay, it has other issues. Yeah. Clear? So, I mean, I guess many of us would know about the Northern Ireland conflict and situation, but maybe some of us won't, so I'm going to do a really quick lecture. Okay, basically, the whole of some parts of Ireland were under British control for the past 800 years. Segments of the population which with time have defined themselves as Irish as against British, Catholic as against Protestant, nationalist as against unionist. Unionists support the union between Britain and Ireland, the nationalists oppose it. So we had armed rebellions and political agitation for the past 500 years or so. And what we call the Republican movement, which is the more militant, the armed struggle segment of this. Its lineage is at least to the days of the French Revolution and the United Irishmen Rebellion of 1798, with all sorts of incarnations, and then the Easter Rising of 1916 and the Irish War of Independence just after World War I. The Irish War of Independence ends with the partition of the island. This becomes this becomes the Republic of Ireland. This bit in the northeast becomes Northern Ireland. In the 60s, after decades of discrimination against the Catholic minority, which remains in Northern Ireland, in the 60s, violent conflict involving the British security agencies, pro-state loyalist groups, and Republican underground groups. Chief of them was the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which is considered one of the most organized, effective, disciplined, ruthless armed groups or terrorist organizations of the past century. Even the British Army kind of reluctantly admitted that it's been a worthy adversary. 1998, the Good Friday Peace Agreement and the ceasefires ended this bit of the conflict. The IRA decommissioned its weapons and disbanded in 2005. Some splinter groups, which call themselves the Real IRA, Continuity IRA, the New IRA, still operate, but they're really small compared to the IRA. There's still some political issues, borders, Brexit. That's the 60 seconds on Northern Ireland. In the cultural consciousness of the Irish national struggle, informers occupied a huge place. In films and novels and ballads, the figure of the informer is very prominent. James Joyce, a century ago, talked about this image that in Ireland, just at the crucial moment, there's an informer that screws the rebellion. One of my interviewees, when I asked him, why are people so concerned about informer? And this is not a joke. I mean, this is how we describe it. 30 years ago, 300 years ago, 500 years ago, informers came and brought down the struggle. But informer are also seen as folk devil. Folk devil is the term from Stanley Cohen's famous book, Moral Panics and Folk Devils. The very first interview I've done for this research, my very first question, I always started the interview with an open question. When I say the word informer, what is your first association? So my very first, the first seconds I have on tape from this project, I would rather be called a pedophile than to be called an informer. This is from what was effectively the IRA newsletter. When you hear the word informer, you don't picture anything, you just get a sense of revulsion. And the assumption was that what the IRA does is kill informers. Jerry Adams, who has been one of the prominent Republican leaders, once said the consequences of informing is death. This is a famous or infamous interview of Martin McGuinness, the other prominent Republican leader, saying, you know, Republican activists who become informers, they know very well what will be their fate. Peter Taylor, the journalist, asks him death, and he gets the quote, death, certainly. Okay, so that is the image, that is the assumption. But underneath it, in practice, we see a much more complicated system. Yes, informers were killed, but there are a few other very interesting and surprising features. One of them is that the IRA was careful to always suggest and claim that they use due process, that they use legal processes, that they use a court-martial system. The IRA also offered amnesties. Can you see this? Offered amnesties for informers, and the whole anti-informing norms and practices have expanded beyond this. Okay, so now, as I said, I'm going to talk about three issues: legitimacy, stateness, and social control. Now, legitimacy is, of course, one of the major themes in policing studies. But on first look, it may appear not relevant to armed groups. Okay, we consider armed groups to be inherently illegitimate, irrational, evil, and so on. So on some level, it may appear strange to even talk about legitimacy. But in reality, the majority of armed groups engage in legitimation work, which is a phrase I borrowed from Ian's work on private security companies. Okay, and this is an example to the type of research I'm doing, because we know that private security companies have some legitimacy problems, but I want to say armed groups are doing similar things, not the same, but similar things. Armed groups depend on a sense in the surrounding communities that their actions are legitimate. They depend on some level of support, even if passive. There's the famous phrase from Mao Zedong that the guerrillas should be like fish swimming in water. Okay, the rebel are the fish, the community is the water which sustains it and protect it. And this is especially true for armed groups which have political wings and for armed groups which have a national agenda, as opposed to kind of smaller vanguard groups. And the IRA has been both. It was embedded in a wider constituency. And this is true for many other armed groups. There's sometimes a perception that the armed groups or the terrorists or whatever, they kind of come from elsewhere and take over the community, but armed groups normally emanate from within the community. They don't kind of drop from the sky. They come from the same people. And the targeting of informers is especially challenging, because on the one hand, the community expects it to take action against informers, because the struggle is screwed because of informers, because people go to jail because of informers. So if you're not going to do anything, you lose your legitimacy. At the same time, the informers are from within the community. So if you're going to kill them excessively, indiscriminately, and so on, you're also going to have a legitimacy problem. So as my interviewees were saying, when I asked them about these issues, they say, well, of course the IRA will be tempered in its response. It's not you gave information, bang, you're dead. Okay? And this is contradicting actually the rhetoric of McGuinness and Adams, who say, well, of course. So I was asking, this is a quote from a very, all the interviews were anonymous, but you know, this is a very serious senior person. And he was looking at me like, no, basically saying it's common sense, Yudufus. Of course, we're not going to just kill everyone. We need to show a support base that people actually did what they say we did. Otherwise, we're losing. It's a people's war. It's a guerrilla war. We can't alienate these people. So what they did is a form of a performance of legality, using the idiom, the language, the practices of criminal punishment, and creating a kind of version of what Tom Tyler refers to as procedural legitimacy. Now, what I'm interested in is not if the IRA's court-martial were actually fair and actually true. I don't know. What is interesting is that they try to create this image of due process, that they found it appealing, that they found it important, that they invested resources and exposed themselves to risk by insisting on these processes. The amnesties, so the IRA, as I said, at the beginning it was kind of periodically. They announced a 1-week amnesty or a Christmas amnesty, and they said, during this period, if you come to us, you say you've been an informer, we're not going to kill you. And at some point it became a permanent policy. Okay, you come to us and confess, we're not going to kill you. You probably have to leave Northern Ireland, but we're not gonna kill you. I'll go back to amnesties later, but in this sense, amnesties is also part of the legitimation work. So in this sense, the IRA can show themselves as being responsive to the community. The community is saying, hang on, you killed too many people recently. They are saying, yeah, okay, got you. It's even the phrasing, decided to respond positively to approaches from concerned people. And it's interesting, it also represents a kind of pragmatic approach similar to what David Garland called adaptation strategies. It's also saying, look, we can't get rid of all the informers. We have to find a way of managing it. So there's a quote here saying, look, it's not a moral issue. Of course, we were allowed to kill them. That would have been the right thing to do. But you have to have a strategy. You can't go around with revenge. Okay, you have to have a strategy. Legitimation work is also, I was talking about legitimation work toward the community, but it's also internally. People are not going to volunteer to be part of an underground armed group if that group has a reputation of killing people in this unfairly for being suspected of informing. Okay, and again, it's a kind of it's also a pragmatic thing. It's also about maintaining unity, stopping the organization to kind of descend into feuds as other armed groups have done over the years. So my interviewers were kind of saying we were very conscious of other examples of armed groups that because of accusation of informing descended into feuds. That was their term. And we wanted to have a process. We wanted to stop it. We wanted people to know that if the rank and file, to know that if their comrades, the cellmates, former cellmates in prison and so on, if they were killed as informers, this was because they were informers. Because otherwise you'll get this kind of horizontal revenge going on. And at some point, the IRA has competed with another group called the INLA, which had the same agenda. They were kind of competing for recruits. And in this kind of situations, there was the first Intifada, there was something similar between Fatah and Hamas in the occupied Palestinian territories. Sometimes you want to create an image of an organization that has fair internal punishment when you compete on this kind of market of young militants looking for a place. And there's also a perception that the fair process is actually effective. Okay, so again, I asked one interview, why did you bother to do kind of court martial? I mean, it would have been easier for you just to shoot people and run away. And again, he looked at me as, you know, his eyes were saying, obviously you have no experience in running an underground campaign, but he was saying it's common sense, you know. If you have informers, you're not going to solve the problem by killing the people you think are informers. You know, it's not going to help. So the fair process is also seen as effective. Okay, so we have this kind of combination of pragmatic and ideological issues, and also there's a sense in the sociology of armies, of militaries, there's a sense of even armies that carry out atrocities and war crimes, which most armies do, there's a sense of proper army, there's a sense of soldierness, there's a sense of we're part of a legitimate organization. And it's also in the IRA, they were proud of it. They said, you know, we had fair processes. We were like a legitimate army. We weren't like other groups. And it's part of self-legitimation. It's part of self-identity. So we can see that legitimacy concerns, they constrain the punishment. They limit what an organization can be, but they also become a platform with which an organization can claim legitimacy. So it's legitimacy of the punishment and by the punishment. I'm going to try to be a bit quicker with the two other issues, so we'll have time to go to bed before midnight. So the other issue is that, and again, it's counterintuitive, but many rebels, many non-state armed groups actually aspire to look and behave like states. Okay, they mimic their adversary. Many, especially in ethno-national context, armed groups want to become the government, want to become the state. They engage in state mimicry. They use what's called in the literature language of stateness. They want to look like states. Sometimes the symbols, it's pseudo embassies, and so on. But what I suggest, and here Lucia's work was influential, that punishment, this type of criminal punishment, is so attached to the idea of the state, to the authority of the state, that it gives armed groups a really important resource to distinguish themselves as state-like. So what we commonly associated with terrorist armed groups is, you know, planting of bombs, explosions, shooting at soldiers, hunger strikes in prison, and so on. This doesn't allow you to distinguish kind of isolated terrorists from a state like People's Army. It's actually the internal punishment that allows you to behave like a state, that enables you to do it. And James C. Scott has this famous book, Seeing Like a State. So I've been using him and using the term punishing like a state. Okay, and again, I'm not saying anything normative here. I'm not saying it was better or worse, but I'm saying it's interesting that they try to use the discourse and the practices of state punishment. So if you look at the language of IRA statements, they insisted, and this drove the British government mad. They used terms like arrests, questioning, admitted to criminal activity. Here's just one typical statement about the killing of informers. He was executed for breaches of General Army orders. He was court-martialed and found guilty. After due consideration of his case by the army authority, he was executed. Now, from the state perspective, this is nonsense, absurd, oxymoron. You know, it's the criminal offense of abduction and murder. Who cares about this make-believe world? But from the community's perspective and from the organization perspective, it's very, very meaningful. We don't murder, we execute. Okay, we have all of this, and it's interesting, and it may be a separate discussion, but they use the term death penalty, and they use the term execution, and the protocols of killing. So if it's a bit gruesome, were actually like had many of the attributes of the modern state execution. So there was a division of labor. The executioners were not the same as the judges. There was a kind of choreography, last rites. I won't go into details, and it was outside of public view. And this is, for example, as opposed to in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 80s. A lot of the time, suspected informers were killed in a kind of public lynching with the so-called necklacing. Similar things happened in Palestine. And here it was always outside of public view, somewhat similar to the modern execution. And amnesty is really interesting here in this case. I think the most challenging thing a rebel group can do is actually to declare the grant amnesties. I mean, this is the most brazen kind of challenge, saying we hereby grant an amnesty. I mean, think about, I don't know, the Italian mafia or something, saying we hereby give a 1-week amnesty. I mean, it challenges our perception because the power not to punish is a better illustration of the sovereign power than just going around killing people. Okay? Going around killing people, everyone can do. Declare an amnesty and enforce it is a state-like measure that only organization with control and with discipline can do. So in the book, I'm elaborating, you know, Douglas Hay and all of this kind of theory, but I think it's really interesting the way the power not to punish is claimed here. And we can talk about it more in the discussion if you want. The other thing is treason. So they emphasize that informing is treason. And treason, again, is a category, is the paradigm of offense against the state. You can betray your friends, your spouse, your university, but treason is something you do against the state. And there's lots of work about the 16th, 17th century, the rise of the modern state, and how treason and stateness are co-constitutive. Whatever. For the nation state needs treason, and treason needs the nation state. So if you call something treason, you call yourself a nation state. And the Republicans were all the time emphasizing this is not a betrayal of the organization. This is a betrayal of the people. In Imagined Communities, the famous book by Benedict Anderson, which I think is the most cited work in social sciences, which I've been referencing left, right, and center without reading until a couple of years ago, and then I read the whole thing, and it's much better than the kind of shorthand version we get, but he talks about how treason makes sense only when you have an imagined nation state. If you don't have it, then the question is treason to whom? Who is the fellow national of whom against whom are committing treason? So I'm suggesting that treason is a way to create the imagined community. It's not just a result of the nation state, it's also a means to assert the existence of a nation state. And it's interesting here that a lot of the people in the nationalist community were against the armed struggle. The IRA never had the support of the majority of its constituency. But even these people will not inform themselves and will not have a good thing to say about informers. There's a line from Seamus Heaney, the famous Northern Irish poet, where he writes, "I am neither an internee nor an informer." Internee means people who were interned. So he's basically saying, I'm not part of the armed struggle, so I haven't been interned, but I'm also not an informer. And this space between not an informer and the rest creates the imagined community. I mean, it marks the boundaries of the community. To some degree, it's enough to say someone is not an informer in order to mark the community. As people say, I'm becoming conscious of time, so I'll run a bit quicker. The third thing I wanted to talk about is social control. And here again, once we kind of use the intellectual toolkit of punishment and society, yeah, we say, forget terrorism, bring me the culture of control and governing to crime and moral panics and the rest of them, let's see what it does. So it broadens our perspective and we become we can see other elements and features which relate to that. And what I suggest in more detail in the book is that the threat of from informers, the threat of informing gave a rationale, a platform for the leaders to enhance social control in the area itself and in the community. Okay, it was a security problem, but a solution for governance. Okay. You can justify all sorts of intrusions into private lives and into the community by saying this is the threat of informant. For example, the control of alcohol drinking among the rank and file, which the leaders were concerned with because sometimes it gave the organization bad name if young people are going around drunk and so on. But it would be hard to tell the young IRA members don't drink alcohol in public. It was justified by the rationale of if you'll be drunk in public, you're going to tell people a secret and there'll be another informer in the pub. Okay, and more generally, it can be a means to enforce unity to go against dissent. One of my interviewees was saying, well, if there's a group of people and you know other people are looking for informers, you don't want to be the weird one. You don't want to stand out. You don't want to do strange things because people will suspect you. Okay, so it's a means for control, and it also becomes a kind of didactic tool. You need the informer, the folk devil, the traitor, to articulate the polar opposite, which is the martyr, the rebel. And Stuart Hall and his comrades and collaborators in Policing the Crisis talk about it. The folk devil is the alter ego for virtue, and this is you can see the not very subtle allusion to the Judas motif, the 30 pieces of silver. This is the informer, and then people are dead and they go to prison. And this was from around just after the hunger strikes, where 10 Republican prisoners went on hunger strike till death, and so part of the motives of Irish republicanism is the martyr, the ability to endure, the ability to suffer, and the informer is the antithesis of it. So it also becomes a useful training, socialization, a social pedagogy tool. You need an informer to highlight what the other is. And finally, another social control and adaptive strategy we see is the use of pedagogy campaign. Okay, so the IRA the Republicans use posters and graffitis and statements and leaflets and press conferences to talk about informers. Some of it was the warnings, the kind of used to call the scared straight thing, but that was, I think, a very minimal part of it. Part of it was about providing a script for behavior. If you're approached by the British security agencies, this is what you should do. And people would go on press conferences and would say, I was under pressure last week this is what happened, and a Sinn Féin or a Republican figure would say, you have done the right thing. And it went on and on and on, there's tons of stories and so on. Sometimes it would be related to the amnesty policy. So people will come and say, I have been an informer for the past 2 years and it was terrible. And the other person will say, so it provided a kind of script. Partly it was about enlisting the public, shifting some of the responsibility to the public. For example, in this kind of loose talk motif, people will be told, don't talk in public about anything about the struggle because there might be an informer somewhere. And you can see how the community is recruited into it. So this is a message again from this kind of IRA newsletter. Stop and think, don't talk. If you do it, you will accomplish the most important task and play your own part in the struggle. So everyone in the community can take part in the struggle by engaging in it. And then the next step is to be on the lookout for those who are asking the questions, pass on your suspicion to the right quarters. So there's a kind of counter surveillance. So the IRA would have its own informers in the community to inform it about state informers. And so this is one of the famous posters which kind of sum things up. It's based on a famous World War II British propaganda poster, and everybody knew it, that was conscious. So one thing happening here is saying we are like a state during war. The informers are like Nazi agents. The other thing is this kind of illusion of, because there's a double meaning here in the Lustow slide. So there may be informers in taxis and in football stadium and so on, but we'll also be there. We know what you're doing. Whatever you say nothing. Again, it's one of the famous phrases of, stop doing it. It's one of the famous phrases in Northern Ireland. So the target audience for that is, I think, the community. You're not going to have many people who are privy to IRA secrets who were going to talk about it in a football stadium and will see this poster and say, no, I'm not going to do it. They knew better. The target is the community and all of these messages which the pursuit of informers allow us to do. I'll just finish with 1 minute of broader bringing it. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the implications of all of that is how sometimes punishment and social control is directed at the insiders. A lot of punishment in society in recent years views punishment as something targeted at the outgroup, at people not like us. The criminology of the other, Michel Alexander, Vacant, it's about, punishment is about migrants, foreigners, ethnic minorities, the poor. But here we see that sometimes punishment at its most intense is actually directed at people like us, at the insiders, at the traitors. It's what Padurai called the fear of small numbers. It's not about the other. It's not the kind of barbarians in the gate. It's the people from within the walls. It's about that, and to some degree, it brings back Durkheim, the founding moment of all of this. About punishment is about enforcing norms within the community. It's about restoring authority within the community. So I'm not suggesting that most punishment in most countries is not about the other, but I'm just saying the focus we had on that is maybe leading to some blind spots, and I think a lot of what we see in popular culture, the obsession with serial killers and so on, is exactly about how punishment and social control at its most extreme and intense is about people who look exactly like us but behaving in deceitful ways. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much.